Welcome to Yes-MLS. This tutorial will cover the rules and regulations. We'll go over why we have rules, what those most common rules are, and how we implement them. First, as a member services organization, it's necessary that all members work together and have fair and equal access to the data in our system. We have rules in place so that it enables all of the members to have the same rights and equality in the system. It also assures that our MLS is as accurate as possible. In order to put a listing in our system, it's required that you have a listing agreement. We allow exclusive right to sell, exclusive right with reserved prospect, and exclusive agency type listings. Once you obtain one of those listing agreements, you're able to enter your listing into our system. We do not allow an authorization to show form, a listing input sheet signed by the seller, or an email stating a request to list a property. We do have one exception to this rule, and that is comp only. Those can be entered without a listing agreement, and we'll go over those in detail throughout this video. With your listing agreement, you must have a list date. The effective date or starting date of the term of the exclusive right to sell or exclusive agency agreement is what we are looking for in a list date. Your contract may have words such as effective, commence, start, or beginning on. That's what you should use as your list date in your listing. If that language does not appear, we ask you to use the last chronological signature date of the seller as your list date. If any area of conflict or inconsistency arises, state law or regulation will take precedence. If you have an example where your property is being relisted and a new listing agreement has not yet been secured, you're allowed to use the previous agreement. However, there are some requirements. Your seller must initial the new list date and redate the listing agreement. If there are any new terms and you're making changes on a previous listing agreement, your seller must make those changes and initial all of them. We do strongly recommend that you obtain a new listing agreement wherever possible. It will keep your paperwork clean. We have what we call a 48-hour rule. New listings that are in our territories and in specified property types must be entered within 48 hours. Status changes and extensions, as well as price changes to any listing that's entered into our system, must be made within 48 hours. Please note that weekends and postal holidays are not considered working days and are not counted in the 48 hours. Also, there are some changes that have a longer grace period, and we'll cover that later in this video. This is a nice little chart that says if you take a listing on a Monday, it has to be entered Wednesday by midnight. And notice down at the bottom, Friday through Sunday. If you take a listing on any of those days, since we don't count the weekends, those listings would have to be entered by Tuesday at midnight. So the property types that the 48-hour rule applies to upon original entry are single family and condominium, which fall under the residential property type, multifamily units, which are from 2 to 4 units, and then land zoned either residential or farm agricultural. Commercial listings, rental listings, and land zoned other than residential and farm or agricultural do not have to be entered into our system at all. Our counties include these in Ohio and these in West Virginia. So any listing you take in these counties that fall within our required property types must be entered within 48 hours of the list date. This is a nice little graphic that shows all of the counties that are included. There are some exceptions to that 48-hour rule. I mentioned rentals and commercial. Auctions are not required either, and anything outside of our area. Properties entered in multiple property types do not require that second property type to be added within the 48 hours. That might include a property that has multiple zoning types. For example, you have a single family home that is also zoned multifamily. The primary property type needs to be entered within 48 hours. The secondary property type does not have to be entered within that time frame. And then business only with leasehold are not required within the 48 hours. Please remember that once the listing is in the system, any changes need to be made within that 48-hour time frame. We do have an exception where if your seller is from out of town or is mailing back your listing agreement, if you should not receive that in a timely manner, we understand that you can't enter that until you have the listing paperwork in hand. So hold on to anything that can prove that it was late, including postmarked envelopes. And when you're audited on that, we'll ask that you send over the proof that the listing was entered late because you did not receive the paperwork in a timely manner. If your seller faxes or emails their listing agreement and it's outside the 48 hours, hold on to anything that can show that, including fax sheets that have a time and date stamp across the top, or your email inbox that shows when that email was received. And again, submit that paperwork when requested. If you cannot provide a postmarked envelope or documentation showing that the listing was received late, a note from your seller showing when they sent their paperwork will suffice. Another exception is new construction, where you might have a blanket or master agreement. This is where you have many properties under one builder's agreement. Those won't be entered on the same day. They are entered as they are made available. We will need a copy of that blanket or master agreement in order to make sure that those properties aren't penalized for what would appear to be a late entry. The next exception is if you take listings by a third party, for example, a bank or a relocation office or a corporate listing. Sometimes though there is a delay in receiving the paperwork within the 48 hours, please hold on to anything that can prove that that was late and send us a property full printout and the agreement signed by that third party when requested. And again, listings that can be listed in multiple property types based on their zoning, and that's the key here. They have to be zoned in multiple ways. It can't just be something that an owner states this property could be used as a residential or a multifamily. There must be proof in zoning. The primary property type needs to be entered within 48 hours. The secondary property type can be entered outside that 48. Keep in mind that on those listings, you must cross-reference the MLS numbers of the two associated listings. When a listing that was entered in the multiple list type closes, you can only mark one of those closed. The other needs to be withdrawn. Also, you are not allowed to place the same property under multiple subtypes within a main property type. And that's a little confusing, but the bottom line here is if you take, for example, a cluster home, that cannot be entered as a single family and a condo. It must be entered the way it was zoned, and you'll find that in your realist or your auditor record. A property can only be placed under one subtype in the system. When you have exceptions to the 48-hour rule, all relevant documentation must be mailed or faxed to Diana at our office. The fax number is 216-485-4159 or emailed to Diana at yes-mls.com. Your seller has the right to opt out of the MLS, and we call those exempted or no MLS listings. Listings that are opted out of the MLS are not allowed to be entered in the system for the life of that listing agreement, and that is important to share with your seller. If you have a 6-month listing agreement and your seller opts out, they've agreed to opt out for the 6-month period they have on that listing agreement. And just as a reminder, any listing that was opted out of the MLS is not allowed to later be entered as a comp-only type listing. We'll cover that a little bit later in the tutorial. If your seller would like to opt out of the MLS, they must sign a listing agreement, and they must also sign a seller opt-out form, which is provided by Yes-MLS. It's located under the links menu in the system. You will be required to send the listing agreement and the opt-out form to the service within 48 hours of the listing date of that contract. And again, listings that are opted out for the life of that listing agreement, and the seller is not allowed to opt in the middle of that agreement, nor are they allowed to opt out for just a certain time frame during that listing agreement. Once your listing is entered, a primary photo is required to be uploaded within 48 hours from the date you entered your listing. This includes the coming soon and comp-only listings. A primary photo is the front exterior view of your home. The only exception to that is if you have a waterfront property where the waterfront side is truly the front of the property, the front of the home, and the street view is the back or rear view of the home. This applies only to single-family, condo, and multifamily type properties. Photos are not required for commercial, rental, or vacant land type properties. Your seller can opt out of having a photo. They must sign the form located under the links menu. It is the seller opt-out form, and there's a photo section there. However, keep in mind that the agent must still upload a file that we provide. It's under the links menu, and it's called the seller opt-out of photo image. And again, that has to be entered within 48 hours of entering your listing. Coming soon is a status type we have in our system that we've mentioned briefly earlier in this presentation. To enter a coming soon listing in our system, you must have a signed listing agreement and a signed coming soon form. Your listing agreement will be dated for today, and your coming soon date will be within a 14-day period. With coming soon, you must enter the listing within the 48 hours. You must send the documentation, which includes the listing agreement and the form, to our coming soon at yes-mls.com. And you must enter the photo within 48 hours. Keep in mind that coming soon is only good for 14 days. After that point, your listing will move to the active status. In coming soon, days on market are not counted. The listing cannot be shown by the seller or the agents until that property has moved to the active status. If a property is still not ready after 14 days, the seller must authorize that you as the agent move that listing to a temporarily off the market status, or TOMK. And listings will be in the NeoRec system so that agents can answer any questions or email that listing to customers, but the properties cannot be shown until the listing is in an active status. If you would like to advertise your property on public-facing websites, you are allowed to do that as long as it states that it's in the coming soon status and that it is not yet active. Another status we have is temporarily off the market. If you have a listing that is not able to be shown, it should not stay active. Therefore, temporarily off the market is available. You must get your seller's authorization to put the listing in the temp off market status. You must indicate in the broker remarks the estimated day that you think the listing will be available again for showings. Days on market will not be counted during this time frame. And should we find that you are marketing the property or showing the property during the TOMK status, a $500 penalty will be assessed. Please do not show or market your temporarily off the market listings. As mentioned earlier, status changes must be made within 48 hours of receiving your seller's authorization. And this applies to contingent, pending, temporarily off the market, withdrawn, and reactivated status changes. And it also applies to making your extensions and your price changes. We allow different authorizations in different situations. We have written authorization, email authorization, and verbal authorization. Of course, we will allow written authorization for any change in the system. We have some forms that you might find helpful, but they are optional. You can use your own company forms if you wish. With written authorization, again, we will accept that for any change made in the system. However, We will not allow seller's authorization to make changes that are contrary to our rules. Email notification can be given as long as the following applies. The request must come from your seller's email address, and the property address and requested changes must be outlined in the body of that email using very specific dates and prices and effective dates of the change that being requested. We do not accept an email notification for things such as a listing or purchase agreement, withdrawals, or mutual releases. It would apply to changes such as extensions, price changes, temporarily off the market requests, and data changes within the listing itself. We allow verbal authorization for only a few changes, and they include the price or an extension only. Any other change must be given in writing. When you receive that verbal request, you must make the change within 48 hours of the date that request was made. You must get that request backed up in writing, and you have 10 days to obtain that written or emailed authorization. Please make sure that when you follow up a verbal authorization in writing that you have the specifics of that change. You want details such as date requested, specific address, parties involved. You want your paper trail to be very clear. If you're audited after a verbal change and you don't yet have the requested paperwork, you'll have 10 days in order to get that to the MLS, and if we don't receive that in that time frame, the staff will take your listing temporarily off the market and issue a $100 penalty. A few things you need to know about status changes. When you're extending a listing, you absolutely must get that seller's authorization to extend it before the listing expires. If you receive an authorization to extend the listing after the listing expires, you will not be able to make that change in the system. You'll have to obtain a new listing agreement, and you'll enter that listing from scratch. Remember that you do have 48 hours after your seller's permission to make that change in the system. We mentioned temporarily off the market earlier, but we would just want to touch on it again. Temporarily off the market should be used when your listing cannot be shown. If you have an active listing that isn't able to be shown, please take it temporarily off the market. It should not remain active. You must have seller's signature in order to move a listing to temporarily off the market. We require that you disclose in the broker remarks when that listing will become available again. Remember, this does have to be written permission from your seller. We do allow an email to be used for this. Temporarily off the market is a time period where there should be no showings of the property, nor should you advertise that property, such as an open house or actively promoting showings. During this time frame, days on market is not counted. Temporarily off the market listings will not be included in data feeds such as to Realtor.com, Zillow, or any other public-facing website. On the date the listing is to be reactivated, you need to go into the system and reactivate that listing. Days on market will pick up where it left off, and your listing will be fed to public-facing websites. It's noted in the Realtor Code of Ethics and Standards of Practices that realtors shall not misrepresent the availability of access to show or inspect a listed property. Yes-MLS implements that rule, and we have a penalty associated if we find that you are showing temporarily off the market listings. There will be a $500 penalty that cannot be waived if we catch you showing or marketing listings that are temporarily off the market. So please do not allow any showings during that time frame. When you extend a listing, it's important to remember that you must receive that seller's authorization to extend the listing agreement before that listing expires. If you do receive that authorization before it expires, you do have 48 hours to make that extension in the system. We have a status called pending expired. Basically, this is a listing that has a purchase agreement written on it. It was moved to the pending status, and it's reached the listing's expiration date. In that situation, a listing will be moved to the pending expired status automatically. From that status, you will be allowed to either mark your listing closed, or if the deal falls apart, you will then mark that listing expired. Listings that are in the pending expired status are not able to be moved back to an active status. In that scenario, you no longer have an active listing agreement for that property. As a rule of thumb, you may want to request that your seller extend their listing agreement through the terms of the purchase agreement so you don't run into any trouble. Withdrawn statuses are available in two ways. First, withdrawn with release. If your seller and you agree that you will mutually release each other of the listing agreement, you will need to get signed paperwork. This is something provided by your broker. Yes-MLS does not have a mutual release available. And once that mutual release is signed, you can go to the system and withdraw that listing with release. That seller is now able to sell that property with another agent or sell it on their own. They are no longer under contract with you as the list agent. Withdrawn with release listings are not able to be reactivated. Withdrawn no release is a status where your seller no longer wants to market or sell their property, and they've asked you to withdraw the listing from the MLS. In this scenario, the listing agreement is still active and the seller is still obligated to you. However, you, with their request, are no longer marketing that in the MLS. So they're still under contract with the brokerage or firm. The listing is just no longer showing in the MLS as an active listing. Withdrawn no release listings will expire on their expiration date. As mentioned earlier, you have one status that is longer than the 48 hours. We allow 30 days after title transfer to mark a listing sold. And it's important to remember that listings that are in the contingent status will expire on their expiration date, and after they expire, you are not able to make any changes to it. If that happens to you and that contingent listing finally does transfer, Yes-MLS will mark your listing closed in the system as long as you send us the paperwork within 30 days of title transfer. Check with our Yes-MLS help desk or rules department to see what paperwork is required. If you should wait beyond the 30 days and still need that listing marked closed, there'll be a $50 processing fee for that. And again, remember that contingent listings expire on their expiration date. It's a good rule of thumb to get that listing extended through the life of the purchase agreement so this scenario does not happen. We have a scenario called sold before processing. So basically that means that there was an offer accepted before you had the opportunity to get that listing into the MLS within the 48 hours. We require that those are entered and want you to remember that they are allowed. With sold before processing, you must have a listing agreement and a purchase agreement, and that listing agreement must be dated before or the same day as your purchase agreement. When those do come through the system, you will be requested to send paperwork to our rules department. Please don't panic. That's just some of our checks and balances. Comp only has been mentioned a few times. Comp only is a scenario where you had a buyer and represented that buyer on a property that was not listed. Those can be entered into our system as long as you enter those within 30 days of title transfer and that property did not have a listing agreement at time of sale. There are several steps to this process they are located under the links menu under the comp only instructions. Some of the highlights are that they must have a list type of comp only, and in your broker remarks, you must state entered for comp purposes only. The summary is you enter the listing as active and add a photo, change it to pending and then to sold, and then fax the agent full report along with your purchase agreement to the Yes-MLS rules department. They will change the list agent to a non-member and you will remain the selling agent. Again, for full instructions, look under the links tab in the MLS. Our goal is to have a good, clean, accurate database. We have rules in place to help keep the information clean and accurate. We also have audits and system checks in place to keep this data accurate. We run an audit on every 100th listing. We'll ask that your office send over paperwork supporting the changes that were made. We also have spot checks that we run, and we make sure that incorrect data is corrected by reaching out to the agent and the support staff noted in the system. If you're requested to send paperwork within 48 hours and we don't receive it by then, you'll receive one courtesy phone call. And if the paperwork is still not received by the end of business day that day, a penalty will be issued for noncompliance of rules. We've developed penalties such as that to encourage all members to abide by the rules as we have established. We have two types of penalties that are issued. Automatic penalties, where you don't have any notice and we found an error such as a late entry, a late status change, failure to submit paperwork, and failure to submit an opted out listing. Those carry a fine of $100. Automatic penalties are not limited to those listed. Those are just a few examples. We also have something called a one warning penalty. These are issued after MLS staff communicates with the office, once through email and then a second time through a phone call. If the correction is not made, then a penalty would be issued. An example of that would be failure to reflect the correct selling broker or an improper entry of fields. So if you receive a warning from us and then we follow up with a phone call, please handle those in a timely manner to avoid any penalties. Know that you do have the right to appeal any penalty. You can send a letter to our board of directors within 20 days of receiving your penalty. They will review your letter at their next meeting and let you know if that gets overturned or not. If it does get overturned, you pay nothing. If it doesn't, you'll have to pay the fine that was incurred. You can also waive a penalty. You have one opportunity per year to waive one penalty. That does reset in January of each year, and you'll need to register with and attend that class within 60 days of receiving that penalty. Please note that some penalties can't be waived by attending a rules class. The penalties that cannot be waived include sharing your ID and password. That one we're very serious about. It's $1,000 if we catch you sharing your ID and password. Your entire office is turned off until that penalty is paid. If you enter listings in the incorrect list type, on that one, we don't want you to enter exclusive agency listings as exclusive right to sell. Exclusive agency listings include those where the seller has the right to sell it on their own. Everyone needs to know walking through the door that the homeowner has the right to find their own buyer and no commissions paid. Also, abusing the penalty notification process cannot be waived. We don't want to have to keep telling you over and over again not to make a certain mistake. If we find that we're doing that, a penalty will be assigned that can't be waived. And finally, marketing those temp off market listings. For questions on rules, please reach out to our Quality Assurance Department at 216-485-4100 or toll free 888-266-7657, extension 485. Our Rules Department office hours are 8:30 to 5, Monday through Friday. Thank you for watching this tutorial.